This road seems endless. Yeah, but at least the view is nice. Wake me when we move.
These coastal routes are too exposed. We must reroute east immediately. That adds 6 hours transit time. Can we sustain the front? We have to, Commander.
Fill her up. Mark it down, that's 300 gallons. Move the line up now.
In the last week of August 1944, the 3rd United States Army was moving faster than any army had ever moved in the history of warfare. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, ivory-handled revolvers, a voice like a diesel engine, and a temper to match, had his armor rolling across France at a pace that was leaving the maps behind. Since the breakout from Normandy in late July, the Third Army had covered more than 400 miles in less than a month. It had liberated city after city. It had crossed river after river. It had destroyed or bypassed German units that tried to stop it and simply kept going east, always east, toward the Rhine and beyond the Rhine to Germany itself. On August 30th, 1944, the leading elements of the Third Army crossed the Meuse River and pushed toward the Moselle. The German border was roughly 60 miles ahead. In the field, Patton's tank commanders were radioing back that the road ahead was open, that the German defenses were shattered, that there was no organized resistance between them and the Reich, that if they kept moving they could be inside Germany within days. Then the army stopped, not because of German resistance, not because of a tactical obstacle, not because Eisenhower had ordered a halt, though Eisenhower had complicated views about Patton's rate of advance that we will get to. The Third Army stopped because it ran out of gasoline. The tanks that had been burning through France at 30 miles a day ran dry and sat on French roads while their crews waited for fuel that was not coming. The most aggressive army in the Western Allied order of battle, the army that had terrified German commanders from Normandy to the Meuse, was immobilized by the most prosaic of military problems. It had outrun its supply line. This story, the story of what happened in late August and September of 1944, when Patton's army ran out of fuel, is one of the most revealing episodes of the entire European campaign. Not because it changed the outcome of the war, though it may have extended it, but because it illuminates with particular clarity the specific tensions at the heart of Allied strategy in 1944. The tension between boldness and logistics, between the vision of a commander who believed the war could be ended in weeks and the administrative reality of sustaining a modern army across hundreds of miles of liberated France. And it illuminates, specifically, the character of the man at the center of the story, George Patton, who was quite possibly the most gifted operational commander in the American Army, and also one of the most difficult human beings in any army on either side of the war. To understand the fuel crisis, you have to understand what the Allied logistical situation looked like in late August of 1944. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, launched in late July, had succeeded beyond almost anyone's expectations. The German lines had broken, and instead of the grinding advance through hedgerow country that the Normandy campaign had been, the Allied armies were suddenly moving at operational speeds across open country. This was the kind of warfare that the tank had been designed for and that the American armored divisions, in particular, had been built and trained to conduct. It was exhilarating. It was also, from the perspective of the supply officers who were trying to keep the armies fed and fueled, a logistical nightmare. The Allied supply system in 1944 was built around a network of depots and roads that had been planned for a slower, more deliberate advance. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that we discussed in an earlier episode of this series, was running around the clock, moving supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front. But the front had moved so fast that the red ball routes were lengthening daily. Every additional mile of advance required more fuel for the trucks that were hauling the fuel to the tanks. There was a point, somewhere in the mathematics of the logistics, at which the trucks consumed as much fuel getting to the front as they were delivering, a self-defeating equation that the supply officers were watching develop in real time. I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. This series is about the specific decisions and the specific moments that determine how the war was actually fought. Not just the famous victories, but the specific human conflicts and the specific operational failures that shaped the campaign. Subscribe now and hit the bell. Back to the fuel crisis. Back to August 1944 and the decision that stopped Patton's army. The broader question of what the fuel crisis reveals about Allied strategy in the summer and autumn of 1944 deserves examination in some depth, because the debate between the broad front and narrow front approaches was not simply a disagreement between Patton and Montgomery. It was a fundamental strategic question about how to exploit military success, a question that had no clean answer and that the participants in the debate approached from different military traditions, different national interests, and different assessments of what the German army was capable of after the disasters of the summer. The broad front approach that Eisenhower ultimately chose, advancing along a wide front from the Channel coast to Switzerland, keeping all the Allied armies engaged and denying the Germans the opportunity to concentrate their dwindling reserves, had real strategic logic behind it. The Allied armies together had more combat power than the German forces facing them, and using that power across a wide front would eventually crush the German defenses through sheer weight. The approach was methodical and conservative, but it was also lower risk than the narrow front alternative, because a stalled narrow thrust could be counterattacked on its flanks in ways that a broad advance could not. The narrow front approach that both Patton and Montgomery advocated, though they advocated for different narrow fronts, which was part of the problem, also had real strategic logic. The German army in September of 1944 was in a state of crisis. Its losses in France had been catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured, thousands of tanks and guns destroyed or abandoned, the command structure disrupted by the rapid retreat. If that crisis could be exploited with a concentrated thrust before the German army had time to reconstitute itself, the war might be ended before the German defenses were rebuilt. The window was there. The question was whether it was big enough and whether the Allied logistical system could support a drive through it. The answer that history gave, that Market Garden failed and that Patton's Southern advance stalled, does not definitively resolve the strategic debate, because both approaches failed partly for reasons specific to their execution and not just for reasons inherent in the approach. Market Garden failed partly because of specific tactical failures on specific bridges on specific days. The decision to drop the 1st British Airborne too far from the Arnhem Bridge, the specific German counterattack capability in the Arnhem area that intelligence had underestimated. Patton's advance stalled partly because of the specific decision to prioritize the Northern Logistics Corridor, which was itself a consequence of the Market Garden commitment. What the September pause definitively established was a specific consequence of not having an adequate logistical system to support a deep, rapid advance, a lesson that military historians and logistics officers have cited repeatedly in subsequent decades as a cautionary example of what happens when operational ambition outruns administrative support. The specific men who were responsible for the Allied logistics in 1944, Lieutenant General John Lee at the Communications Zone, the officers of the Transportation Corps, who managed the Red Ball Express, the port engineers who were struggling to open Antwerp and the other channel ports faster than the Germans were destroying them, deserve more recognition than the history of the European campaign typically gives them. They were working with an inadequate system under conditions of extreme demand, and the specific failures of the supply system in August and September of 1944 were not primarily failures of individual incompetence. They were the product of a planning assumption that the advance would be slower and more methodical than it turned out to be, that the brilliant success of the breakout had rendered obsolete. The planning assumption had been wrong in the best possible way. The advance was faster than expected because the German army had collapsed more completely than anyone had predicted. But this success had created a supply crisis that no amount of individual effort could fully resolve in the time available. The trucks were not fast enough. The roads were not numerous enough. The fuel was not close enough to the front. and by the time the supply situation was adequate to support a deep advance, the German army had used the pause to rebuild its defenses in ways that made the deep advance considerably more costly than it would have been in August. Patton understood this, or claimed to understand it, with great clarity and great bitterness. His post-war memoir, War as I Knew It, is one of the most revealing documents of the European campaign, not because it is a balanced assessment of the strategic situation. It is not. Patton's assessments of his own contribution and of the contributions of his peers and superiors are systematically self-serving, but because it captures with unusual clarity the specific operational perspective of a commander who believed he had been denied the means to win the war quickly. The memoir is also, in its way, a document about the specific kind of frustration that is uniquely military. The frustration of knowing or believing you know that the situation is winnable and watching become harder, while the means to win are allocated elsewhere. This frustration, which is present in the accounts of many of the most capable officers of the European campaign, is not simply ego. It is a product of specific understanding of how opportunity works in offensive warfare, that windows open and close, that momentum builds and dissipates, and that the cost of hesitation is measured in the time required to rebuild what was lost and the lives spent rebuilding it. Patton paid that cost in the autumn of 1944, fighting the grinding battles of Lorraine with resources he considered inadequate for the opportunity he believed had been missed. His soldiers paid in the mud of the Saar, and the reign of the Siegfried Line approaches. And the German soldiers who had been given the September pause to rebuild their defenses, who would otherwise have been fighting a mobile battle against an advancing Third Army rather than defending prepared positions against an attacking one, paid it in the sense that their own lives were extended by the weeks and months that the Allied supply crisis had bought them. The specific geography of the European campaign in the autumn and winter of 1944, the specific places where the battles were fought after the September pause, illustrates the cost in concrete terms. The Hurtgen Forest, where American divisions were fed into a battle of attrition against prepared German defenses in terrain that negated every American tactical advantage, was one of the bloodiest and most futile episodes of the entire European campaign. The Hurtgen was fought in part because the September pause had given the Germans time to prepare the Siegfried Line defenses that made the approaches to Germany so costly. The relationship between the logistical failure of August-September and the tactical failures of October-November-December is real, even if the specific causal chain is complex and contested. The men who fought in the Hurtgen, who went into the forest and found that the skills that had served them in the mobile warfare of August were useless in the close, dark, artillery-dominated fighting of the autumn, were paying a price that Patton believed had been made unnecessary by the September decision. He was not wrong that a price was being paid. He may or may not have been right that it could have been avoided. Patton crossed the Rhine in March 1945 ahead of Montgomery, and he was right to be proud of it. The Third Army had fought its way across France and through the Saar and through the Siegfried Line and across the Rhine on a route that had been available since September, and it had done it in less time than the broad front advocates had promised and at lower cost than the pessimists had predicted. The specific argument about whether it could have been done faster, in September rather than March, and whether 6 months of additional fighting could have been avoided, is one that military historians will continue to make, and that the evidence will never fully resolve. What can be said with confidence is this: the August 1944 opportunity was real. The German army was genuinely shattered. The window existed, and the fuel ran out. Whatever might have happened if the fuel had been there is permanently unknowable. What happened when the fuel was not there is permanently recorded. The army stopped, the window closed, and the war that might have ended before Christmas of 1944 continued through the winter and into the spring of 1945 at a cost in lives that is also permanently recorded, and that no amount of strategic argument can make anything other than what it was. Patton died in December 1945, 12 days after a car accident on a German road near Mannheim. He never returned to the United States after the war. He is buried in Luxembourg in the American Military Cemetery of Ham, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army, the men who drove across France with him in August, who ran out of fuel with him in September, who fought through Lorraine with him in the autumn, who crossed the Rhine with him in March. He is buried with them rather than separately at his own request. He had spent his life with soldiers. He is spending his death with them. The story of the fuel crisis is, At its core, the story of what happens when the best available operational talent meets the limits of what the system can support, when a vision of command runs ahead of the capacity of logistics. It is a story about the specific weight of what is not available, and the specific price of what cannot be done because the fuel is not there, and the trucks are not enough, and the road is too long. And it is a story about a man whose certainty about what could have been achieved haunted him to the end, and whose specific kind of military genius was both the cause of the problem. He had moved so fast that the supply system could not keep up, and the victim of it. He was stopped not by Germany. He was stopped by the mathematics of distance and the finite capacity of trucks to cover it. The specific character of George Patton, the man inside the legend, beneath the ivory-handled revolvers and theatrical profanity, and the carefully constructed image of martial ferocity, is essential to understanding the fuel crisis and what it meant, because the fuel crisis was not simply a logistical problem or a strategic disagreement. It was, for Patton, a personal affront, a violation of what he understood to be the fundamental principle of military command, which was that the commander with the momentum and the opening should be given the resources to exploit it. Patton had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had studied cavalry tactics and armored warfare with the fanatical devotion of a man who had identified, early, the specific kind of warfare he was built for. He had read everything, Clausewitz and Napoleon, and the history of every major campaign he could find, looking for principles of mobile warfare that he would apply when the opportunity came. He had practiced and theorized and argued and waded through assignments and postings that used his talent without fully engaging it. And then, in the summer of 1944, the opportunity came. The breakout from Normandy, the open country of France, the shattered German armies retreating before him, and he had seized it with everything he had. The specific operational achievement of the Third Army's advance across France in August 1944 is not adequately captured by the phrase moving fast. What Patton had done was something more specific and more demanding. He had maintained the tempo of the advance under conditions that would have caused most armies to slow down and consolidate. His units were spread across a vast front. Their supply lines were stretched to the point of precariousness. The risk of an unexpected German counterattack against an overextended flank was real, and Patton knew it. And he kept going anyway, because he understood that the German capacity to counterattack was diminishing with every day of the advance, and that the risk of slowing down and giving the Germans time to reorganize was greater than the risk of continuing. This judgment, this willingness to accept tactical risk in order to maintain operational momentum, is a specific quality that made Patton irreplaceable in the breakout phase of the European campaign. It is also the quality that made him dangerous in coalition warfare, where the risks he was willing to accept with his own units extended, through the connected nature of Allied operations, to the flanks and the lines of communication of other commanders who had not been consulted about the risk appetite. The relationship between Patton and his immediate superior, Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group, had much of the same tension that characterized Patton's relationship with Eisenhower, the tension between a commander of extraordinary operational talent and difficult personal qualities, and the institutional framework that was trying to channel that talent in productive directions. Bradley was a more conventional and more diplomatic commander than Patton, methodical, careful, oriented toward the broad front approach that characterized American operational thinking. He and Patton had a complex relationship that combined genuine professional respect with persistent friction about priorities, resources, and the specific pace and direction of the advance. Bradley's decision to support the fuel allocation that went north to Montgomery rather than south to Patton was made within the broader context of Eisenhower's strategic direction, and it was a decision that Bradley was uncomfortable with. He shared some of Patton's skepticism about market garden, though he expressed it with considerably more restraint. His memoir, written after the war, contains some of the most balanced assessments of the fuel crisis period, acknowledging both the genuine opportunity that existed in August and the real constraints that limited what could be done about it. The specific role of the Red Ball Express in the fuel crisis illustrates the complexity of the logistical problem in ways that are worth understanding. The Red Ball Express was, as we discussed in an earlier episode of the series, an extraordinary logistical achievement. A continuous truck convoy system that moved supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front around the clock. At its peak, it was running approximately 6,000 trucks, carrying roughly 12,000 tons of supplies per day. But the mathematics of the situation were working against it. As the front moved further east, each truck had to drive further to reach it. A truck that could make a round trip from the beaches to a depot 50 miles inland in a day could not make a round trip to a depot 300 miles inland in a day. It needed multiple days for the round trip, which meant it was not available for other loads during that time. The further the advance, the more trucks were tied up in transit rather than delivering loads, and the less actual supply was arriving at the front per truck per day. This was not a failure of organization or will. It was the arithmetic of distance applied to a vehicle fleet of finite size. The solution that the supply planners were working on, the development of pipeline systems, the use of railways that could be repaired and put back into operation, the establishment of forward depots that would reduce the distance that trucks needed to travel, was the right solution, but it took time to implement, and time was exactly what was not available in August 1944 when the opportunity was at its peak. The specific decision to use captured German fuel, to seize whatever fuel was found in German dumps and depots as the advance moved east, was another element of Patton's approach to the supply problem that his staff implemented with considerable creativity. German fuel dumps existed throughout France and Belgium, left behind as the German retreat accelerated. Third Army units that stumbled on these dumps would report them to headquarters, and the fuel would be transferred to Third Army vehicles as quickly as it could be moved. This was entirely legitimate under the laws of war. Captured enemy supplies were available for use, but also required a kind of aggressive, opportunistic approach to logistics that characterized Patton's command style and that not every Army commander would have applied with equal vigor. The autumn campaign that followed the September halt, the battles in the Saar and Lorraine, the fighting for Metz and Nancy, and the approaches to the Siegfried Line was a period in which Patton's army demonstrated that it could fight the grinding attritional battle as well as the mobile exploitation battle, though at greater cost and with less of the specific elan that had characterized the August advance. The Lorraine campaign from September through November 1944 is one of the less celebrated chapters of the Third Army's history, partly because it lacks the dramatic narrative of the breakout, and partly because its achievements, significant in their own right, were harder won and less visually compelling than the racing advance across France. The Siege of Metz was a specific episode of the Lorraine campaign that illustrates a transition from mobile to attritional warfare. Metz was a fortress city of considerable historical and military significance. It had withstood sieges throughout European history, and its fortifications, updated over centuries, were still formidable in 1944. Patton's initial approach to Metz was to bypass it, consistent with the mobile warfare doctrine that had served the Third Army so well in August. But the German defenders used the fortress to threaten the Third Army supply lines in ways that made bypassing it ultimately untenable, and the Third Army had to invest with a formal siege operation that took weeks and was entirely unlike the kind of warfare Patton had built his reputation on. The contrast between the August advance and the Lorraine siege, between the Army moving 30 miles a day across open France and the Army conducting methodical siege against fortifications in October rain, is the best illustration of what the September fuel shortage actually cost. Not just miles or days, but the specific kind of momentum that is the most valuable and the most perishable commodity in offensive warfare. Momentum, once lost, is not simply recovered by restoring the fuel supply. The German defenses that had reconstituted themselves in September had to be broken through in ways that the August advance had made unnecessary. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the German Ardennes offensive that we discussed in the context of the Ghost Army episode, gave Patton what was arguably his finest hour as an operational commander, and it illustrates precisely the qualities that made him both invaluable and infuriating. When the German offensive broke through the American lines on December 16th, the Third Army was engaged in its own attack toward the Siegfried Line to the south. Within 24 hours of the German breakthrough, Patton had turned 90 degrees and was executing a northward attack toward the besieged garrison at Bastogne, an operational reorientation of an entire army in contact with the enemy that military professionals still discuss as one of the most difficult maneuvers of the war. The speed with which Patton executed this pivot, which required the disengagement of multiple corps from their current operations, the reorientation of supply lines, and the attack of an exhausted army through winter conditions toward an objective 60 miles away, was extraordinary by any standard. He had, characteristically, been thinking about the possibility before it was asked of him. When Eisenhower called the emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th and asked the assembled commanders how quickly they could attack north, Patton said he could attack in 48 hours with 3 divisions. The room was briefly speechless. 48 hours, for the kind of operational pivot Patton was describing, was approximately impossible. He did it anyway, in 48 hours and 20 minutes. The relief of Bastogne on December 26th, the Third Army's corridor reaching the surrounded garrison in the snowbound Belgian town, was the operational coup that saved the Ardennes situation, and that is probably, in purely military terms, Patton's greatest single achievement of the war. It required exactly the qualities that the September fuel crisis had illuminated from the negative side: the willingness to accept risk, the ability to move faster than anyone expected, and a specific drive to accomplish the objective that everything in Patton's character had been building toward his entire life. He was the right general for some of the most important moments of the European campaign. He was also, consistently and characteristically, one of the most difficult men in any room he occupied. These two qualities were related. The same confidence that made him capable of the Bastogne pivot was the same confidence that led him to steal fuel in September and to say things about his allies that created diplomatic crises and institutional problems that Eisenhower had to clean up. The qualities could not be separated, which is why managing Patton was the price of having him, and why Eisenhower paid that price, and why the European campaign ended the way it did, with Germany defeated, the Rhine crossed, and George Patton standing on the German side and having just informed a superior that he had urinated in it. Some things about George Patton were exactly as advertised. The senior Allied logistics officer, Lieutenant General John Lee, who ran the communication zone that managed the supply chain, was dealing with a situation that had no good solutions. The supply system was not designed for the speed of the advance, and the advance was not going to slow down to accommodate the supply system. The question was not whether there would be shortfalls, but which units would receive the available fuel and which would go without. This question, which armies, which corps, which divisions got the fuel, was not a purely administrative one. It was a strategic one, because the armies that got the fuel could advance, and the armies that did not could not. And the different armies were advancing in different directions toward different strategic objectives, each of which was being argued for by commanders of strong views and powerful personalities who were convinced that their axis of advance was the one that could end the war. Eisenhower faced the central strategic decision of the European campaign in the last week of August 1944, a broad front strategy, in which all the Allied armies advanced roughly simultaneously across a wide front, keeping the German defenses stretched and preventing them from concentrating against any single thrust, or a narrow front strategy, a single powerful drive to the German lines at one specific point, using all available resources to achieve a decisive breakthrough that could end the war before winter. Montgomery, commanding the British and Canadian forces in the north, was the primary advocate for the narrow front strategy. His plan, Market Garden, proposed a massive airborne operation to seize bridges in Holland and open a corridor for the ground forces to drive into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. The plan was audacious, it was potentially decisive, and it required the concentration of Allied logistical resources on the northern axis, which meant, specifically, that Patton's southern advance would be starved of fuel to feed Montgomery's northern operation. Patton, commanding the Third Army in the south, was the most vocal opponent of this approach, and his opposition was not subtle. He believed, with a particular certainty that characterized everything he believed, that the southern axis offered the more promising route into Germany, that the Third Army, if it could be kept supplied, could drive through the Saar, cross the Rhine, and be in Frankfurt before winter. He believed that stopping his advance to support Montgomery's plan was not just operationally wrong, but personally intolerable, a subordination of the better army and the better general to the inferior army, and the inferior general for reasons that had more to do with British institutional politics than with military logic. His views were expressed, as Patton's views generally were, without diplomatic restraint. He told anyone who would listen that stopping his advance was a mistake. He called Montgomery's plan a bridge too far, a phrase that would eventually become the title of a famous book about Market Garden's failure. He lobbied Eisenhower directly and persistently for the resources to continue his advance. And when he did not receive those resources, when Eisenhower made the decision to support Market Garden and the northern axis, and the fuel that might have kept the Third Army moving went north instead, Patton did something that was characteristic of him in its creativity and in its ethical ambiguity. He stole fuel, Not personally. Patton was not rummaging around in fuel depots with a siphon hose, but his staff, on his instruction and with his full knowledge, diverted fuel shipments intended for other units, intercepted supply convoys that were not earmarked for the Third Army, and generally used every logistical sleight of hand available to them to keep the Third Army's tanks moving a little longer than the supply allocation officially permitted. The amounts were not decisive. The diversion of a few thousand gallons here, and there could not substitute for the systematic reallocation of resources that the Third Army actually needed, but they were enough to keep the lead elements moving for a few additional days, to add a few additional miles to the advance, to keep the pressure on the German defenses that were trying to reconstitute themselves in the Saar. The ethics of what Patton did, diverting fuel allocated to other Allied units, which meant that those units went short, is a question that military historians have treated with a certain sympathy toward Patton, because the outcomes of his advance generally justified the aggression, and because the alternative approach, Market Garden, ended in the disaster at Arnhem that Patton had predicted. But the sympathy should not entirely obscure what was actually happening. A general was taking resources allocated to other generals and using them for his own operation without authorization because he disagreed with the strategic decision that had been made by a superior. This is a significant breach of military discipline, rationalized by operational success, and was characteristic of the specific way that Patton operated throughout the European campaign. The relationship between Patton and Eisenhower, the two men from the same generation, who had known each other since the First World War, who had served together in the interwar years, who understood each other's capabilities and limitations with an intimacy that few military relationships achieve, was the central personal dynamic of the American effort in the European theater. Eisenhower had gone to bat for Patton repeatedly, defending him when his behavior created institutional crises that would have ended any other general's career. The slapping incidents in Sicily in August 1943, when Patton slapped two soldiers he accused of cowardice in field hospitals, creating a scandal that reached the United States and produced calls for his relief, had nearly finished him. Eisenhower had kept him, not because the behavior was acceptable, but because the operational talent was irreplaceable. The price of keeping Patton was managing him, managing his conflicts with other commanders, managing his public statements, managing the political fallout of his periodic departures from the discipline that the coalition required. Eisenhower paid this price because he understood something that the critics of Patton's behavior sometimes fail to appreciate, that in the specific kind of warfare that the European campaign required, the fast-moving, aggressive exploitation of opportunity that characterized the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, Patton's specific combination of personal aggression, operational vision, and the ability to transmit his will to his subordinates was a military asset of the first order. The decision in late August to give priority to Market Garden over the Southern advance was, from Eisenhower's perspective, a calculated choice between two imperfect options. The broad front strategy that Eisenhower generally preferred had the virtue of keeping all the Allied armies engaged and preventing the Germans from concentrating, but it spread the available supplies so thin that neither the Northern nor the Southern advance had the resources to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The narrow front approach could, in theory, achieve the kind of concentrated punch that the situation seemed to call for, but it required betting everything on a single axis and accepting the risks of failure that a concentrated advance in one direction carries. Market Garden was a test of the narrow front theory, and it failed. The airborne forces seized the bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, but the bridge at Arnhem, the bridge too far, was not held. The 1st British Airborne Division, dropped at Arnhem to seize the Rhine crossing, was surrounded and destroyed in one of the most costly British defeats of a European war. The ground forces that were supposed to relieve them could not fight through the narrow corridor in time. The operation failed. The Rhine crossing was not achieved, and the war continued into the winter with the German defenses reconstituting themselves along the western border of the Reich. Patton's prediction had been vindicated. This did not make him humble. It made him more certain, more vocal, and more difficult. He spent the autumn of 1944 fighting the battles of the Saar and Lorraine with the resources he had. Less than he believed he needed, less than he was convinced would have been decisive if only the supply allocation had been different. The specific operational problem of the fuel shortage and the specific strategic question of whether a properly supplied Third Army could have ended the war in 1944 became one of the enduring debates of the European campaign. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The counterfactual, what would have happened if Patton had received the fuel he needed and had driven into Germany in September 1944, cannot be resolved by the available evidence. The arguments on both sides are real. On Patton's side, the German defenses were shattered in late August. The road ahead was open, and the window for a decisive breakthrough was present in a way that it would not be again until the spring of 1945. On the other side, the German army had demonstrated throughout the war remarkable capacity for reconstituting itself after catastrophic defeats, and the logistical situation that had stopped the Third Army was a real constraint that would not have disappeared simply because Eisenhower had directed more fuel south. What is not in doubt is what the fuel shortage felt like to the men who experienced it. The tank crews who'd been moving at 30 miles a day and suddenly found themselves sitting on a French road waiting for fuel that was not coming experienced a specific frustration that combined the soldiers' universal impatience with inaction and a more specific frustration of men who could see the objective, who were close enough to Germany to be thinking about what would happen when they got there, and who were stopped by something that seemed, to them, like an administrative failure, rather than a military necessity. The German commanders who were watching the Third Army stop, who were in the process of trying to reconstitute their battered forces in the Saar, and who had been expecting Patton to crash through them before they could, had a different perspective. For them, the September pause was a gift. Every day that the Third Army sat on the French roads waiting for fuel was a day that German engineers were working on defensive positions in the Siegfried Line, that German staff officers were reassigning units and filling gaps, that the organized military resistance that Patton had shattered at Avranches and driven across France was slowly reforming into something that could be defended. When the Third Army resumed its advance in the autumn of 1944, with more fuel, but facing a more organized German defense than it had encountered in August, it found the going considerably harder than the August advances had been. The autumn and winter battles in the Saar and Lorraine were not the kind of mobile, exploitative warfare that Patton and his army were built for. They were grinding attritional battles against prepared German positions, costly in men and time, and the specific kind of momentum that the August breakout had built and that the September pause had allowed to dissipate. Whether this was a decisive turning point that Patton believed it was, whether a continued advance in September would have ended the war months earlier than it actually ended, remains one of the open questions of the European campaign. The operational historians who have studied it most carefully tend toward a cautious conclusion. The opportunity was real. The German defenses were genuinely shattered in late August, and a properly supplied advance might have achieved significantly more than was achieved. But the logistical constraints were also real, and the reconstitution of German defensive capacity was faster than Patton's advocates sometimes acknowledge. Patton himself never doubted. He believed until the end of his life. He died in December 1945, 6 months after the war ended, from injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim, that the September fuel shortage had cost the Allied cause months of war and tens of thousands of casualties. He believed he had been right and Eisenhower had been wrong. And he said so in the specific way that Patton said things, without qualification or diplomatic softening. He may have been right. The evidence is not conclusive either way. But the specific moment in late August 1944, when the most aggressive army in the Western Allied order of battle sat on French roads with empty fuel tanks, while 60 miles away the German border waited, and the window for decisive victory was open and then closing. That moment is one of the most vivid illustrations in all of military history of what happens when the operational genius of command collides with the unglamorous reality of logistics. Wars are won by men and machines, and the fuel that moves them. The fuel runs out. The generals rage. The window closes, and the war continues, grinding forward through the autumn and the winter and the spring, until the fuel lines are long enough and the supply is sufficient and the advanced resumes in Germany is finally reached, not in September 1944, when the road was open, but in March of 1945, when the Remagen Bridge was taken and the Rhine was crossed at last. Patton crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. As it happened, he called Eisenhower to report it and said he had just pissed in the Rhine, and he wanted Eisenhower to know that the Third Army had done it without any of those goddamn airborne. Some things about George Patton were exactly as advertised. The popular version of Patton, fixed in the public imagination by the 1970 film starring George C. Scott, is a version of the fearless, profane, visionary warrior stopped not by the enemy, but by the timidity of his superiors. This version is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. It leaves out the parts of Patton that made him genuinely difficult. The slapping incidents, the fuel theft, the consistent inability to operate within the institutional constraints of coalition warfare, and it leaves out the genuine complexity of the strategic situation that Eisenhower was managing. The fuel crisis most complicates the heroic version of the Patton story, because it requires acknowledging that the same qualities that made him the Army's best offensive commander, the willingness to accept risk, the refusal to be constrained by conventional logistics, the drive to keep going when every administrative calculation said a stop, were also the qualities that created the crisis in the first place. He had moved so fast that the supply system could not keep up. The supply crisis was not simply something that happened to Patton. It was, in part, something that Patton created. This does not mean he was wrong to move fast. In the specific military situation of August 1944, moving fast was the right choice. It was destroying the German army and creating an opportunity that the war had not previously offered. But the opportunity created a problem, and the problem did not have a simple solution, and the man who had created the opportunity by moving fast was not well positioned to solve the problem, because solving the problem required slowing down, which was the one thing that Patton's entire character refused to accept. The fuel crisis is, in this sense, a story about the limits of a single quality of mind, however valuable that quality is, when it encounters the full complexity of large-scale military operations. Patton's operational genius was real, and it was consequential, and it shortened the war in Europe. His inability to accept the logistical constraints that the same genius had helped create was also real, and it produced a specific frustration and the specific failures of September 1944. The best commanders in any enterprise, military or otherwise, are the ones who understand not just their own strongest qualities, but the limits of those qualities, and who can adjust when the situation requires something other than what they do best. Patton was not that kind of commander. He had one gear, and it was forward. In August 1944, that was exactly the right gear. In September 1944, the situation required something else, and Patton could not give it. The war ended without him getting the chance to prove, finally and definitively, that he was right about September. He crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. He drove into Germany and across it, but he never got the unimpeded advance that the open roads of late August had seemed to promise. The fuel ran out, the window closed, and the question of what might have been remained, as these questions always do, permanently open. He is buried in Luxembourg with his soldiers. The ivory-handled revolvers are in a museum in Texas. The tanks that ran out of fuel on French roads in August of 1944 are in junkyards and memorials across Europe. And a specific moment when the most aggressive army in the Western Allied order of battle sat still on a French road while Germany waited 60 miles ahead. That moment remains one of the most vivid and most debated episodes of the entire war. The specific historical debate about whether the September 1944 opportunity was decisive, whether a properly supplied Third Army could have ended the war in 1944, has been conducted by military historians with a rigor and a care that the popular version of the Patton story does not always reflect. The most careful analysts tend toward a nuanced conclusion. The opportunity was real, the window was there, and the German army was genuinely vulnerable. But the German army's demonstrated capacity for rapid reconstitution and the specific logistical constraints of the Allied position make it unlikely that even a fully supplied Third Army could have achieved the decisive breakthrough that Patton envisioned. The German army had reconstituted itself after disasters before, after the collapse in France in 1940, after the disasters on the Eastern Front in 1941, after Stalingrad and Kursk, after the catastrophe of the Falaise Pocket in Normandy. Each time, the German military machine had used whatever breathing space was available to reassemble some degree of organized resistance. The September pause gave it breathing space again, and it used it. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, was not fully manned or fully operational in September. By October, it was considerably more formidable. But the specific argument that Patton would have broken through even a partially manned West Wall in September, and that the subsequent drive into Germany would have been decisive, is not implausible. The German reserves were thin. The air superiority that Allied tactical aircraft had established over the battlefield meant that German movements were costly and exposed. The specific combination of Third Army momentum, Allied air power, and German weakness in September was a combination that would not exist in the same form later in the campaign. What the historians cannot do, what no amount of archival research and operational analysis can resolve, is answer the counterfactual with certainty. The question of what would have happened if the fuel had been there is not a historical question, in the sense of a question that the available evidence can answer. It is a speculative question that the evidence can illuminate but not resolve. And the specific frustration of the fuel crisis debate is that it is precisely the kind of question that demands resolution, that the stakes were high enough and the moment was specific enough that it feels like there should be an answer while remaining permanently beyond the reach of the evidence. Patton would have had an answer. He had an answer from the day the fuel ran out until the day he died in a German military hospital in December 1945. The answer was, yes, we could have ended it. Yes, the road was there. Yes, the window was open. And yes, the decision to close it, to send the fuel north to Montgomery rather than keeping it south of the Third Army, was one of the great strategic errors of the war. History has not fully agreed with him, but history has not fully disagreed with him either. The September opportunity was real. The cost of missing it was real. And the specific question of whether it was decisive, whether the fuel in Patton's tanks in late August 1944 could have been a fuel that ended the war in Europe, remains, as military historians will tell you, genuinely open. The Third Army fought from July 1944 to May 1945. In that period, it advanced further and faster than any army in the history of American arms. It killed or captured more German soldiers than any other single Allied army in the European theater. It crossed the Rhine and drove across Germany and ended the war in the south, while other Allied armies were still fighting toward it from the west and the north. And it did all of this despite, or perhaps in some sense because of, the specific fuel crisis of September 1944 that stopped it temporarily, and that Patton spent the rest of his life believing had cost the war months and thousands of lives. He was buried in Luxembourg in December 1945 in the American Military Cemetery at Ham. His grave is set apart from the others. He was a 4-star general and the protocol required it, but he is in the same cemetery on the same hillside with the men he commanded. He had asked to be buried with them. In the theater where he had fought, they gave him that. The ivory-handled revolvers are in a museum. The tank columns that race across France in August 1940 exist now only in the photographs and the memoirs and the operational histories. The French roads where they stopped in September are ordinary roads now, carrying ordinary traffic, unmarked by what happened on them in the last week of August 1944. But the question that the fuel crisis poses, the question of what is lost when the fuel runs out and the window closes, and the opportunity that was there is not there anymore, that question does not go away. It is the permanent question of every campaign and every enterprise that runs up against the limits of what the system can support. The vision outran the logistics. The army stopped, and the war went on. Stopped not by Germany, by an empty drum on a French road in the last week of August 1944, 60 miles from the border of a country that was waiting to be reached. The men of the Third Army, the soldiers who were in the tanks and the trucks and the supply vehicles when the fuel ran out, experienced the September pause differently from their commander. For Patton, the pause was a strategic and personal affront, a denial of the decisive victory he had been building toward. For the soldiers, the pause was something more ambiguous, a rest after weeks of constant movement, but also a frustration and also a return of fear. The men who had been moving had been too busy to be afraid in the conventional sense. The pace of the advance, the daily movement, the constant radio traffic, the tactical problems of each new position had occupied the mind in ways that static warfare did not. When the fuel ran out and the army stopped and the days began to pass with the same positions visible on the same maps, the fear had more space to operate. The German lines ahead, which had seemed to be retreating fast enough to be theoretical, solidified into a real defensive barrier with real soldier behind it. The tank crews who sat in their vehicles on French roads waiting for fuel were not simply waiting for fuel. They were watching the strategic opportunity close from ground level, watching the German positions ahead grow more organized, more fortified, more formidable with each passing day. They understood, in the specific way that soldiers understand things, that the situation ahead of them was getting harder. The roads that had been open in August would not be open in October. The Germans who had been running would not be running in November. The fuel that had not come in September would not, when it came in later months, buy back the specific opportunity that the September pause had cost. This knowledge, combined with the accumulated fatigue of the summer campaign and the specific uncertainty of what came next, produced a particular psychological state of an army that has been moving and has stopped. Alert but not occupied, experienced but not invulnerable, aware of what was possible and watching it become less possible with each passing day. Patton's response to the state and his troops was characteristic. He kept them busy. He kept the training going. He kept the planning proceeding. He kept the aggressive spirit alive in the units that had been moving by making sure they understood that the stop was temporary, that the fuel would come and the advance would resume, and the Third Army would be first into Germany. He was probably right that keeping the Army spirit alive during the September pause was essential to the autumn campaign that followed. An army that had fully absorbed the weight of the missed opportunity would have been harder to animate for the grinding battles of the Saar. The specific qualities of leadership that this required, the ability to maintain morale in a stopped army, to sustain the aggressive spirit of men who were watching their opportunity diminish, to transmit his own certainty about the resumption of the advance to men who had reason to doubt it, were different from the operational genius of the August advance. They were the quieter, more sustaining qualities of a commander who understands that armies are made of men, and that men need to be led not just in the moment of action, but in the moments of waiting. Patton was not typically celebrated for these quieter qualities, because his operational brilliance tended to dominate the account. But the Third Army that came out of the September pause and fought the battles of Saar and crossed the Rhine and drove through Germany was the same army that had raced across France in August. The same men, the same units, with the same aggressive spirit intact. That the spirit was intact after the pause is not simply the product of Patton's operational brilliance. It is the product of how he led his army in the weeks when there was nothing to do except wait for the fuel and keep the edge sharp and tell the men that when the advance resumed, the Third Army would be ready. They were ready. The advance resumed. Germany was reached, and the war that had seemed almost over in August finally ended 8 months later in May of 1945. Patton did not live to see the peace. He died in December 1945, 6 months after the victory, from injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for and then fighting the war. And when it ended, there was nothing in the peace that required what he was. The war had given him everything he was built for, and then it had ended. He is in the cemetery in Luxembourg with his soldiers. The question he spent his life asking, what if the fuel had been there, remains, as all such questions remain, without a final answer. The fuel ran out. The army stopped. The window closed. That is the Patton story. That is what the empty drum on the French road actually cost.